As a Victorian with tickets to today's AFL Grand Final waiting for him, it's an absolute privilege to have one of Australia's rising political stars with us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator James Paterson.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much. And I'll say at the outset, I hope my speech is less newsworthy than Bettina Arndt's yesterday, but we'll see how we go. Andrew, you've just made a very eloquent case for why it is that we do what we do. And I'm going to make the bold assumption, since all of you have bought a ticket to be here, that following Andrew's speech, you didn't immediately get up and leave, that you too are also convinced that why we do what we do is important, that liberty is worth fighting for. And so I don't think you probably need any more convincing on that. We all agree why we should fight for liberty. The question I want to tackle this morning is how. Famously, we don't always agree on how we should tackle liberty, what the best way is to pursue liberty. And so I want to begin with the trite disclaimer that you often hear when we have discussions like this. Everyone pursues liberty in their own way, and for a movement that believes in freedom, that's okay. Personally, I welcome any productive efforts towards the right end goal. But I think we do have to take an interest in how effective the methods are that we choose to pursue these goals. I have a relatively unique perspective. I used to be on the outside of the political system, trying to influence it in a positive direction. Now I'm obviously in the political system and participating in at least some of those decisions firsthand. Of course, when I was at the IPA, I used to think that if we just had enough good people elected to Parliament, and if they just made the right decisions, then all would be right with the world. Now, of course, that I'm in Parliament, I just think if we had a few more IPAs, all would be right with the world. Now, while we all envy the United States in particular because of their vibrant think tank culture, we do have in Australia a lot of really good people doing good work across the country. Places like the Centre for Independent Studies, the Menzies Research Centre, the Australian Institute for Progress, and elsewhere. Think tanks do play a very important role, and not just because they supply the intellectual ammunition that others can use. What they also help do is they help frame what is politically possible by stretching the Overton window to include ideas that otherwise might not get a hearing. When think tanks propose radical reform, they make the task of more modest reform in the right direction a lot easier. Parliamentary politics and think tanks are some of the obvious tools that we have at our disposal, but they're not the only ones, and I'll return to parliamentary politics later. Conferences like this, Andrew, play a really important role. We are engaged in an intellectual task, and socialising the ideas that we have is a vital part of that. That's why this weekend is very important, as are the conferences organised like the Friedman Conference by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance and the Australian Libertarian Society, the H.R. Nichols Society Conference, the Samuel Griffith Society Conference and others. Activism and campaigning, on the other hand, I think it's fair to say, has not historically been a strong suit of ours on the broad centre-right of Australian politics. That's why I really welcome the entry of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance into Australia. It was a really important initiative. The activist projects that they've run, in particular their legalised vaping campaign in recent years, have made a really profound and important difference. But there's room for a lot more. Coordination between like-minded bodies has also been a weakness. This is despite Tim Andrews' best efforts to organise the Australian version of Grover Norquist's famous weekly meetings. Unless we can effectively form coalitions and work together in the way that the left does on the discrete issues where we agree, where we have consensus, then we are going to continue to be out-organised by the left. Given the profound challenges that we face philosophically in our schools and our universities, educating future generations of young people about the cause of liberty is a major, major task that we have. Mancal and Ron Manners have been doing amazing work in this area over in Perth for decades or more, And I know it's become a much greater focus of the IPA in recent years. We do have a really compelling story to tell young people, but if they don't hear it from us, they are not going to hear it at all. And if they don't hear it from us, then we're going to lose them forever. Legal activism is a much more common tactic used in the United States than it has been here in Australia. Some of you will remember Brian Pape, who passed away in 2014, and he was a real pioneer in Australia in legal activism. He famously challenged the Rudd government's stimulus package all the way to the High Court and was almost successful, and led some really great efforts on behalf of property rights causes around the country. And I know there are some people here this weekend actually who are involved in an upcoming challenge to the anti-free speech safe access zones laws, along with the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is a project associated with the Australian Christian Lobby. If we had success on that front, it would fundamentally reshape legal activism in this country in a positive way. Now, of course, to do all of this, you need the support of generous donors. And while, again, we often envy the philanthropic culture of the United States, in my time in the cause, I've met some amazingly generous people. They are out there, and if you can convince them that you have good ideas, they will back you. The eagle-eyed and the observant among you will notice that there's a very popular form of campaigning for liberty that I haven't mentioned so far this morning, and that is being a hero on Facebook. The reason why I haven't mentioned it yet until now is because, in my view, it's the least effective way of campaigning for liberty, even though it might be personally satisfying. I encourage those of you who focus only on coming up with witty Facebook comments on politicians' Facebook pages or elsewhere to channel your energies into more productive avenues. I want to come back though to parliamentary politics and talk frankly with you about the strengths and weaknesses of the focus on parliamentary politics that I've obviously decided to have. The truth is often when a decision reaches us in Parliament, it's often too late to change the direction. So much has happened in our culture, in the media, in our legal system, in our political system, that by the time something gets to Parliament, it's too late. But it's not always the case. Sometimes you can have a very profound impact at that last point in the process, in the political process, and you can change the direction of things for the better. Some of you would have been at the Friedman Conference earlier this year where I talked about how it's much easier in my experience to stop bad things from happening in the parliamentary system than it is to get a good initiative, a good positive initiative up. And the reason for that is that our political system has a very heavy status quo bias. In order to get up a good new idea, you have to pass 10 formal and informal hurdles, from Senate committees to passing the floor to backbenched committees to cabinet to all the different processes you have to go through. And so that means, for example, those of us who've been campaigning to fix 18C have had to pass a lot of hurdles. And even if we pass 9 out of those 10 hurdles, as we did, if we failed at the 10th hurdle, then nothing happened, and that's of course what's happened with 18C. It's why it's been so hard to get up positive protections for religious liberty, although I'm hopeful that we will make some progress on that front. It's why it's harder than it should be to balance the budget and to cut regulation. But on the positive side, that means it's easier to stop really bad things from happening. If a good idea has to succeed at 10 formal and informal hurdles, in order to succeed, a bad idea also has to succeed at all those hurdles. And to stop a bad idea, you only have to make it fail at one of those hurdles. One of the experiences I had early in my time in Parliament was relating to a proposed extradition treaty with China. The government had agreed, in principle, to sign a treaty that would allow Australian citizens and other people within our jurisdiction to be extradited to the Chinese criminal justice system. It's a criminal justice system which boasts a 99.9% conviction rate, which is to say it's not a justice system at all. And I was profoundly disturbed that my government at the time was proposing that we should have an extradition treaty with China and attempting to reassure us that don't worry, there'd be sufficient safeguards, and we'd never send anyone over to the Chinese legal system that wasn't really guilty. Well, I didn't have confidence in that, and happily a small number of my colleagues agreed. And in this instance, It only took a small number of us to say that we were deeply uncomfortable with this, that we thought it was not consistent with the values of the party that we represent, and that if it came to a vote in the chamber, if necessary, we would cross the floor and we would vote against it. And the simple act of 3 MPs in this case saying that and others contemplating it was enough to get the government to withdraw the bill altogether. On the other side of the equation, we're making really good, slow and steady progress on vaping. I believe it is insane that in this country you can legally buy a cigarette with all the harm that we know that does to your health, but an alternative, which is 95% better for your health, is unlawful for you to buy or to sell. That's crazy. And it's something that should be able to fix quickly, but because of that status quo bias I was talking about, it doesn't happen quickly, but we're making really good progress. We have a health minister who openly says he's completely unconvinced that we should make this change, but even he has agreed that we should have a genuinely independent and scientific look at the evidence on vaping. And I'm confident about what that evidence shows, because it will show the same thing in Australia as it showed in the United Kingdom and in Canada and in America and in New Zealand and in the European Union. And that is vaping saves lives. So we'll get there in the end on things like that, even though it does take time. So we do all pursue liberty in our own way. I've chosen parliamentary politics after some time at think tanks. It is important that we're pushing on all fronts, but it's important that we are critical with ourselves to make sure, is what we're doing actually making a difference? Are we actually changing things? Will we actually be able to look back one day with a sense of satisfaction and not one of disappointment that we've actually made a difference? So I welcome your involvement in that task, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
The marriage legislation back in December. Now we know, or most people would know, the efforts you made to get amendments, but I guess I see the tragedy is, why was the bill, Dean Smith's bill, allowed to be introduced without the amendments? I mean, why in the Liberal Party could you have yourself as a Liberal trying to get another Liberal, make amendments after the fact, after it's been introduced? I mean, what went wrong there, and basically who's to blame?
Fair question. I've always supported same-sex marriage. I think it's wrong for government to prevent 2 people who love each other from formalising that relationship and calling it a marriage. So I've always supported same-sex marriage, but I've never wanted to see that come at the expense of other people's freedom. And the truth is, because of the anti-discrimination law framework we have in this country, there is a risk that it will. And I fear that there will be the cases we've seen elsewhere in the world, United States and Europe in particular, where people who are conscientious objectors to same-sex marriage, who have a sincere and genuine belief in the traditional definition of marriage, will in some way become victims of the change in the law. That's why I prepared an alternative bill to the Dean Smith bill, which would have both legalised same-sex marriage and protect religious freedom and free speech and freedom of conscience and the rights of parents at the same time. Now, my bill wasn't introduced just because of the reasons of arithmetic. A majority of the Senate, which included all Labor senators, most of the crossbench, all Greens, and a handful of coalition senators, voted to say that only Dean Smith's bill could be introduced and only Dean Smith's bill could be considered, so my bill couldn't be introduced. That's why we broke it down into a series of amendments and then moved those amendments to the bill, Dean Smith's bill, and tried to build it up to the same level of protections that my draft bill offered. As you know, we fell short. But we only fell short because of, being brutally honest, the relatively weak position of the Liberal and National parties in the Parliament. The overwhelming majority, in fact, 89% of Liberal and National MPs voted for at least one substantive amendment to protect religious freedom. So this was not a debate that was won and lost within the Liberal National Party. It was very clearly in favour of religious freedom. But because we have no majority in the Senate and such a slim majority in the House, it only took a handful of people in our own party who didn't agree voting against those amendments to ensure that it went down. Had the 2016 election been a greater success from our point of view, many of those amendments would have passed, simply because 89% of a bigger number in the House of Representatives would have been a majority than 89% of 76 members of the House. So it didn't pass, but it's not over. We're awaiting the Ruddock review and the government's response to it, and I think it will come back and address a lot of those issues.
All right, could you just briefly highlight though, I mean, Mr Brandis, though, being the Senate leader, surely had the opportunity to prevent the Dean Smith version in preference of your version? I mean, it's absurd in the same party. I mean, someone has that ultimate control about what gets introduced.
Well, the chamber has that ultimate control, and this was a private members' bill process, so there wasn't a government position, as it were, and that means it was up to the chamber to vote. The chamber did vote, and a majority voted to do it the way that it did, unfortunately.
What happened with the Paris Agreement, and what is happening with the United Nations Global Immigration Bill? It's an agreement that's being considered at the moment.
Good question. So Paris will never be legislated under a Liberal national government. It was contemplated that our symbolic agreement at Paris would one day be legislated or regulated into Australian law. As bad as legislating it would have been, regulating it would have been even worse, because that would have given a future Labor government the potential to increase our commitments with the stroke of a pen without ever passing anything through either chamber of the Parliament. So I'm very glad that first regulation was rejected, and ultimately that legislation was also rejected, because it means that while we remain a party to the Paris Agreement, and I know Simon Brennan is going to talk about this next, the consequences of failing to achieve our targets are nothing. So we are a signatory to the agreement, and of course I hope that our emissions do fall as they are forecast to, and that we meet our commitments. But if unfortunately, despite our best efforts, we don't meet those commitments, literally nothing will happen. There will be no cost, there will be no penalty, no one will bear any cost from that, other than probably a press release from the UN, and I think we can probably survive that. On the migration agreement, my understanding is, and this is possibly a few weeks out of date, that the negotiations were ongoing, and that some of the things that were in the draft agreement are things which we could never ever sign on to and never ever agree to, because it would come at the expense of our sovereignty. So I don't mind global coordination on refugee flows and processing. That's not something I'm opposed to. But anything that we signed that tied our own hands about how we could protect our own borders is not something we ever should or ever could sign up to, and we won't.
Thanks, James, for a rousing and eloquent exposition on pushing for liberty. I'm just wondering how things like increasing the surveillance powers of the state, telecommunications data retention, and preventative detention orders advance the cause of liberty.
Yeah, fair question, Gabe. Some of those things, data retention in particular, I did work on when I was at the IPA prior to entering the Parliament. And one of the things I was very disturbed about at the time, and my concerns have not changed on data retention, is the absence of the normal judicial oversights that take place. If a security agency thinks that your or my conduct is of concern, then they should go to a court, they should get a warrant, and that warrant should direct our internet service provider to keep our data. I'm not comfortable with preventively keeping the data of all Australians in the fear that one day one of us might commit a crime that they will need to go back and look onto. So that's something that happened before I got there, and I am concerned about. Some of the other things you mentioned are underway right now, in particular the access regime. I'll be very interested to see how that goes. There were options being considered there which, believe it or not, were far worse than what is on the table now. An actual legislated backdoor was under contemplation and consideration, where the government would have required technology companies to basically give a key to the state to access encrypted communications, which would have, of course, been available to the state, but also to others who might want to access it. That particular option is not proceeding, and the best advice I have is what they're trying to do is make the current encryption laws for communication, WhatsApp style technology, equivalent to the existing powers that they have for old-fashioned telephone calls. Now, if that is what it comes out to in the end, then I think that's a reasonable compromise, but I'll be watching it very closely.
What is your opinion on nuclear energy and using it to meet the Paris Agreement's emissions?
I'm pro-nuclear. I think the fact that we have a legal prohibition against nuclear power is a silly thing. I think we should remove it. I think, though, if we did repeal it, it's not necessarily guaranteed that nuclear power would proceed in this country, and certainly not in the short term. I think it's got to prove itself on economic grounds. A lot of the nuclear power that's being built around the world is heavily subsidised by taxpayers, and my preference is to have no subsidies for any form of energy, if at all possible. But at the very least, we should remove that legal prohibition, and if it is a good technology that stacks up economically, then let it rip.
Royal Banking Commission, it sort of shows to a lot of everyday Australians that the big business doesn't really play by the rules that I guess this everyday man plays. And there's lots of other inadequacies in the taxation system, for example. As a somebody who earns a middle of the road income, I feel like big business gets away with a lot of tax breaks, whereas I don't, and I sort of have to subsidize, basically it's quite unfair. So how do you balance the free market policies with approach which will actually meet the sort of what majority of the population will actually think is fair? Because I think that's where the, if I call it right hand side, really falls down sometimes. We talk about liberty, we talk about freedom, but then we make the game seems quite stacked against the everyday man. And then at the end of the day, people vote with their wallets, because I had a lot of friends who used to vote Liberal in Queensland elections, and after Campbell Newman, a lot of them purely for economic reasons, because they were working as nurses, they were working in the industries that he was trying to change. They actually voted against him purely because on their income there was a big impact.
Mm-hmm. One of the perverse things about regulation, all businesses hate regulation, but big businesses hate it a little bit less than small businesses do, because for them it's a fixed cost, and a big business can more easily spread a fixed cost across its customers than a small business can. And so the more that we regulate our economy, whether it's for good reason to protect consumers, what we're really doing is entrenching large businesses at the expense of their smaller competitors. And I think we have to be very careful that in a response to the Banking Royal Commission, we don't further entrench the power and the authority of the big four banks at the expense of some of the innovative new smaller competitors that are coming in, and the competition that could actually really shake up the financial services industry to the benefit of consumers. Because ultimately, a small business doesn't have a regulatory affairs team, doesn't have a corporate affairs manager, doesn't have lawyers on call that can meet the cost of complying with red tape and regulation. Only big businesses can. And the more regulation that we put in, the more incentive we put for small businesses to fold, never to be started in the first place, or merge and become large, big bureaucracies like other businesses do. So we need to guard very carefully against an overreaction on that front. Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, CANZIC is the idea of free trade and free movement between Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK. It's something that I've proposed and has good support in New Zealand. The opposition leader in New Zealand is a supporter. There's a Canadian senator who's also a supporter in the UK. Dan Hannan is a big advocate. So there is embryonic support there. One of the necessary preconditions for that to happen was Brexit, and I'm very pleased that that's happening, although maybe not as smoothly as we would like, but we're slowly on the road to Brexit. And that means that after Brexit, the UK can set its own immigration policy again, and it can set its own trade policy again. And so there is a real opportunity with a good quality free trade agreement between Britain and Australia to start the first steps down that road. My view about the best path to doing this is basically to add the UK and Canada to the existing agreement we have with New Zealand, the Closer Economic Relations Agreement. It basically means there's free movement and free trade between Australia and New Zealand with virtually no restrictions. It's worked extremely well. It is completely uncontentious politically. And I think adding countries that are very like-minded, that have very similar legal systems, very similar cultures, very similar economies, like Canada and the UK, shouldn't be too hard a thing to do.
We're concerned with the lack of, with the inertia that we've got built into the major parties, and so we tend to go to the minor parties. But I'm a little concerned that we're left on our own about this. It's not coordinated, and it seems to be a hit and miss affair as to who the hell gets into the parliament and how effective they are. Is there any way that this can be better coordinated, just from your insider point of view?
One of the really interesting tests is going to be what happens in the Senate after the next federal election. We had a new Senate voting system at the last election, but because it was a double dissolution election, which halved the normal quota required to get elected to the Senate from 14% to 7%, we didn't get a real sense of how it's actually going to play out. I suspect what you'll see after the next federal election, regardless of who forms government, is a substantially smaller crossbench. Almost all of the crossbench is up for re-election, and almost all of the Greens are up for re-election at this election. And there's a real opportunity to knock off a couple of those Greens at least, and some of those crossbenches, in a way that I hope gets a more representative and rational Senate and a representative and rational crossbench. There will be a big decision to be made for people who are involved in minor party activism after that. If the senator that reflects your values and supports you the best is not re-elected and doesn't look like there's a very good prospect of them or anyone being elected in their place, you've got to make a decision. Is it worth going down that major party route? Are you willing to join a major party and accept the compromises that are inherent in that? Or do you want to merge with other minor parties to get critical mass? Because one of the important things about the new Senate voting system is that because voters allocate their own preferences, one of the things we found is they completely disregard the how-to-vote cards they're given. So the major parties, which hand out their how-to-vote cards on the most booths, and you would expect to have the highest rates of adherence to their how-to-vote cards, in the Senate, only about 40% of the people who took their how-to-vote cards actually followed it all the way through. So a minor party handing out its how-to-vote cards on a fraction of the booths has a rate of adhering to the how-to-vote card of a trivial couple of percent. So it's virtually impossible for minor parties under this system to force their voters to preference each other. One of the amazing statistics is that the party that a voter is most likely to vote for after their first party is not the party that is most philosophically close to them, but the party that is closest to them on the ballot paper. And so we had the bizarre circumstance in South Australia where a very substantial number of votes that Bob Day received as the Family First Senator at the last election, which helped him get over the line, came from the Equality Party, which was primarily campaigning for same-sex marriage. Bob Day was a social conservative who was opposed to same-sex marriage. So there just isn't that capacity to direct voters in the way that there has been in the past. There isn't that capacity to do deals. And so the past of having an enormous ballot paper with dozens and dozens of minor parties doing deals with each other is just not going to work in the new system. And so that's a big decision for people to make.
One of those highly esteemed Greens senators has Sarah Hanson-Young. She's called for the government to appoint an independent and objective and fair new chairman to managing director to the ABC. Will Scott Morrison's government start playing to win, or will we continue to be fair when we have the opportunity to appoint people to important, powerful and influential positions in the community?
Yes, it's revealing that both the Greens and the Australia Institute, a left-wing think tank, have said that the most important thing we need in the nomination process for the ABC board is independence. They want independence because they want the ABC to be unaccountable to the taxpayers that fund them. They want them to be a law unto themselves. They want them to be run by the staff as a collective, as it has been for a long time. And they want an independent process because they know that these independent processes almost inevitably lead to the kind of people that they agree with being appointed to these boards. And so if the Greens had any realistic prospect of forming government, I'm sure they'd be very happy with the government directly appointing people that it chooses, but because they don't, they want an independent process in the hope that that will get, so-called independent process, in the hope that that will get the kind of people that they agree with onto the board. You'd be shocked to learn that I actually think that values are an important consideration in who's appointed to the board. CV is important, experience in the industry is important, but values is also important, and a commitment to ensure that the ABC, if we are going to continue to fund it generously to the tune of $1 billion a year with taxpayers' money, that it actually reflective of Australia much more broadly and actually lives up to its charter obligations to be impartial and fair and accurate, then I think we need to make values a very serious consideration in the appointment process. And with that, I better go get on my plane.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.